File 34 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 4, Section 2, of Skepticism with Regard to the Senses, Second Half. I now proceed to explain the second part of my system, and shew why the constancy of our perceptions makes us ascribe to them a perfect numerical identity, though there be very long intervals betwixt their appearance, and they have only one of the essential qualities of identity, that is, invariableness. That I may avoid all ambiguity and confusion on this head, I shall observe that I here account for the opinions and belief of the vulgar with regard to the existence of body, and therefore must entirely conform myself to their manner of thinking and of expressing themselves. Now we have already observed that however philosophers may distinguish betwixt the objects and perceptions of the senses which they suppose coexistent and resembling, yet this is a distinction which is not comprehended by the generality of mankind, who, as they perceive only one being, can never assent to the opinion of a double existence and representation. Those very sensations which enter by the eye or ear are with them the true objects, nor can they readily conceive that this pen or paper, which is immediately perceived, represents another, which is different from, but resembling it. In order...
Okay, this could potentially be a very interesting and important part here. The thing I've been dealing with, the inside-outside dichotomy and access to an outside and so on and so on, right? What makes you say there's an outside? How do you argue for that? And if you say there's an outside, somehow, by some kind of argumentation, this, that, and the other argumentation, whatever you feel is necessary, then how would you possibly have access to that outside if you treat it as such? You're treating your inside experiences as an outside, but that doesn't mean that some part of your experiences all of a sudden is some outside, right? And if you don't have access to an outside, it is a bit of a stretch to say that there's some resemblance between your experiences and an outside, right? There might be something you might sort of allude to, but I might get into that later as Hume delves into this, right? It says, those very sensations which enter by the eye or ear are with them the true objects, nor can they readily conceive that this pen or paper which is immediately perceived represents another which is different from but resembling it. So he's talking about two objects, right? There's one outside, or whatever realm label he wants to put to that realm, as there's an inside that is different, but resembling. It's not, they are not incomparable, but they are not the same. And they are sort of corresponding or something like, sort of the correspondent theory of truth here, right? So let's see how it goes.
Therefore, to accommodate myself to their notions, I shall at first suppose that there is only a single existence, which I shall call indifferently object or perception, according as it shall seem best to suit my purpose, understanding by both of them what any common man means by a hat or shoe or stone or any other impression conveyed to him by his senses. I shall be sure to give warning when I return to a more philosophical way of speaking and thinking. To enter, therefore, Upon the question concerning the source of the error and deception with regard to identity when we attribute it to our resembling perceptions, notwithstanding their interruption, I must here recall an observation which I have already proved and explained in Part 2, Section 5. Nothing is more apt to make us mistake one idea for another than any relation betwixt them, which associates them together in the imagination and makes it pass with facility from one to the other. Of all relations, that of resemblance is in this respect the most efficacious, and that because it not only causes an association of ideas, but also of dispositions, and makes us conceive the one idea by an act or operation of the mind, similar to that by which we conceive the other. This circumstance I have observed to be of great moment, and we may establish it for a general rule that whatever ideas place the mind in the same disposition or in similar ones are very apt to be confounded. The mind readily passes from one to the other and perceives not the change without a strict attention, of which, generally speaking, it is wholly incapable. In order to apply this general maxim, we must first examine the disposition of the mind in viewing any object which preserves a perfect identity, and then find some other object that is confounded with it by causing a similar disposition. When we fix our thought on any object and suppose it to continue the same for some time, it is evident we suppose the change to lie only in the time, and never exert ourselves to produce any new image or idea of the object. The faculties of the mind repose themselves in a manner and take no more exercise than what is necessary to continue that idea of which we were formerly possessed, and which subsists without variation or interruption. The passage from one moment to another is scarce felt, and distinguishes not itself by a different perception or idea, which may require a different direction of the spirits in order to its conception. Now, what other objects, beside identical ones, are capable of placing the mind in the same disposition when it considers them, and of causing the same uninterrupted passage of the imagination from one idea to another? This question is of the last importance, for if we can find any such objects, we may certainly conclude from the foregoing principle that they are very naturally confounded with identical ones, and are taken for them in most of our reasonings. But though this question be very important, it is not very difficult nor doubtful. For I immediately reply that a succession of related objects places the mind in this disposition, and is considered with the same smooth and uninterrupted progress of the imagination as attends the view of the same invariable object. The very nature and essence of relation is to connect our ideas with each other, and upon the appearance of one, to facilitate the transition to its correlative. The passage betwixt related ideas is, therefore, so smooth and easy that it produces little alteration on the mind, and seems like the continuation of the same action. And as the continuation of the same action is an effect of the continued view of the same object, it is for this reason we attribute sameness to every succession of related objects. The thought slides along the succession with equal facility as if it considered only one object, and therefore confounds the succession with the identity.
Yeah. So it's like, oh, it's the same to put it in my modern terms, that if I go and open my door, and it's just the same old experience I have of this sort of what I call the same door, and I go back and next morning I open that door and look at it and whatever I do, then I am sort of I'm considering the same door, right? So that those consecutive experiences are so well related to each other in form, shape, cognition, qualia, and so on, and placement, and all these things that the mind sort of adds to the picture of this sort of consistency. I think I'm on board with that as far as I can understand, right? And if there's something about the way if there's something about my deconstruction you find to be erroneous, please let me know. Give me a comment, right?
We shall afterwards see many instances of this tendency of relation to make us ascribe an identity to different objects, but shall here confine ourselves to the present subject. We find by experience that there is such a constancy in almost all the impressions of the senses that their interruption produces no alteration on them and hinders them not from returning the same in appearance and in situation as at their first existence. I survey the furniture of my chamber. I shut my eyes and afterwards open them, and find the new perceptions to resemble perfectly those which formerly struck my senses. This resemblance is observed in 1,000 instances, and naturally connects together our ideas of these interrupted perceptions by the strongest relation, and conveys the mind with an easy transition from one to another. An easy transition or passage of the imagination along the ideas of these different and interrupted perceptions is almost the same disposition of mind with that in which we consider one constant and uninterrupted perception. It is therefore very natural for us to mistake the one for the other. Footnote 9.
Almost the same. I need to take this one again. An easy transition of passage of the imagination along the ideas of these different and interrupted perception is almost the same disposition of mind with that in which we consider one constant and uninterrupted perception. It is therefore very natural for us to mistake the one for the other. I'm not quite sure what it means, but I think it's along the same lines as it. If we see the same door day after day after day, we look at it. Maybe you don't actually look that very much at your door when you come home, right? But it's one of these things you use all the time, a couple of days, at least a couple of times a day, maybe, right? Without even taking a good look at it. But in all generality, I think it melts in the mind, in the memory, together into a whole story about this door that has been hanging on its hinges for 15 years outside at least, right, while you were using it or whatever, right? So it becomes sort of a part of a story you're telling yourself, right? But I'm sitting here, I'm not looking at my door. I could look in where I could go or try to find it where I expect it to be, right? But I can't say that I know that I have a door out where I would suppose it to be, right? Because I'm not experiencing it. Now, I'm not this kind of, well, you don't know that, so you can't say that, if you're not experiencing the moon, is there a moon now, right? So there isn't a moon because you can't. It's not like, it's skeptical in the sense, right? It's not, what would you call that? Would that be solipsist? I'm not actually eliminativist I don't know all these isms, right? But the answer is I don't know. But I have a very, very, very strong theory, or what would that be called? Would it be called a very strong prediction that there is a door out, a few meters that way, right? And that's good enough for me. But I would have to say, do you know there's a door? No, I don't know. I don't know, right? Because I'm not knowing at this point, because I don't have the impression, right? So,
9. This reasoning, it must be confessed, is somewhat abstruse and difficult to be comprehended. But it is remarkable that this very difficulty may be converted into a proof of the reasoning. We may observe that there are two relations, and both of them resemblances, which contribute to our mistaking the succession of our interrupted perceptions for an identical object. The first is the resemblance of the perceptions. The second is the resemblance which the act of the mind in surveying a succession of resembling objects bears to that in surveying an identical object. Now these resemblances we are apt to confound with each other, and it is natural we should, according to this very reasoning. But let us keep them distinct, and we shall find no difficulty in conceiving the precedent argument. End of footnote 9. The persons who entertain this opinion concerning the identity of our resembling perceptions are, in general, all the unthinking and unphilosophical part of mankind. That is, all of us at one time or another.
yeah.
And consequently, such as suppose their perceptions to be their only objects, and never think of a double existence, internal and external, representing
Double existence, okay. He has said this so many times now. Now I have to go with the understanding that he's suffering from the materialist paradox, right? He can say that there is an object out there. Okay, fair enough. But that is what Immanuel Kant later would analyze his way to, as far as I'm concerned, to the thing itself, which you do not have access to. The thing itself, right? And who knows if there's a thing itself? It's like, if you start to say there's a thing itself, which my door is based on, right? My idea of my door is what I get when I go and have the impression of the door, right? But that impression is in here, right? Or here in my experience, right? Which is not a part of your experience, but try to understand, right? It can be a little difficult to explain. Being in your own head while trying to illuminate something from somebody else's head or mind, right? But if you say there's the thing itself which my door is based on, or I do, then I'm very likely to place a similar image as the door, like the door in that realm I do not have access to, or that I should think I don't have access to, right? So by saying it's the thing itself, you have to keep reminding yourself you do not have access to it, even if you say there's a thing, which is in itself an axiom that is basically not founded in anything and possibly could be labeled as an invalid step, right? I would be very likely to say that. Because if you say there's a realm beyond your experience, that's the first and only step you can take in that direction, right? Because if you say there's a thing in itself outside your experience, you're taking two steps of imagination, you could say. Then you're basing one imagination on another imagination, right? And I think that's invalid. You can only imagine one thing outside your experience, and then that's it. You cannot go any further. Otherwise, you will be basing that further imagination on one imagination, and you can't stack imaginations on top of each other and get anywhere, right? That is an illegal step, in my opinion. If you want to imagine something beyond your experiences, the only thing, in my opinion, you can say is, okay, I'm working from the idea there's something outside my experiences, but I have to leave it alone. I have to leave it alone. I have no freaking way of saying anything about it. And the only, the most reasonable thing to expect in a sense, I don't want to imply anything by using that term, but it is that it's vastly different. If different is even a term you can use in that context, right? If you have an experience of something, why would it be anything like that which it might be if there's something there you could call being, right? And if there's some being of any kind, a thing in itself, then whatever is responsible for creating your experience must be something else than that which it is, right? That which it is doesn't decode itself, travel through your eyes or ears, something like that, then recode, or, it's not, reverse engineering and then traveling as a code and then, normal engineering and establishes some picture that is somehow the same as whatever. That makes no sense, right? So, leave it the fuck alone, right? And that's my, that's a little, I'm a little disappointed, to be honest, about Hume here, right? That is sort of, there are two different, of the same, but they're different. How does he get to that, right? It's like he says that his reality, which is also a part of his mind, actually exists out there and he has access to it, even though he needs an impression, right? So if something has to become an impression and an idea and then some kind of establishment of a dynamic kind of reality in your mind, then that reality can only be in your mind. It cannot be out there, right? It's just like saying, I don't know how to put it, but it's like saying that you can, I've tried this analogy, tried to formulate this analogy. I think it could work, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's something like that you want to understand, if you want to understand, let's say you have a digital camera, right? Though these are DSLR, right? With a big screen on the back, and there's a big box and a lens and so on. If you were not only looking at that screen, but you were basically a part of the screen, and all you could was see that screen. And then your version of the lens and the camera would be what is inside that screen, not that whatever it is out there, right? That's our mind. We are living in that LCD screen on the camera, so to say. We can't get to the lens or the the chassis. What's it called? The box, right? The camera obscura. And then think, okay, but by turning the lens around into the camera from the other side, we can sort of, go through the chip and the glass and the, into the electronics and the motherboard, whatever the hell is in there, right? And somehow get to the understanding this way. It doesn't work because we're still living in that screen, right? We are just so used to being in that screen and having this three-dimensional spatial thing and time and all that shit going on in the mind, right? That it actually feels like that experience is the actual camera outside, but we're just living in the LCD screen, right? Okay.
And represented. The very image which is present to the senses is with us the real body, and it is to these interrupted images we ascribe a perfect identity. But as the interruption of the appearance seems contrary to the identity, and naturally leads us to regard these resembling perceptions as different from each other, we here find ourselves at a loss how to reconcile such opposite opinions. The smooth passage of the imagination along the ideas of the resembling perceptions makes us ascribe to them a perfect identity. The interrupted manner of their appearance makes us consider them as so many resembling, but still distinct beings, which appear after certain intervals. The perplexity arising from this contradiction produces a propension to unite these broken appearances by the fiction of a continued existence, which is the third part of that hypothesis I propose to explain. Nothing is more certain from experience than that any contradiction either to the sentiments or passions gives a sensible uneasiness, whether it proceeds from without or from within, from the opposition of external objects or from the combat of internal principles. On the contrary, whatever strikes in with the natural propensities and either externally forwards their satisfaction or internally concurs with their movements is sure to give a sensible pleasure. Now, there being here an opposition betwixt the notion of the identity of resembling perceptions and the interruption of their appearance, the mind must be uneasy in that situation, and will naturally seek relief from the uneasiness. Since the uneasiness arises from the opposition of two contrary principles,
I think he is describing cognitive dissonance here, but I'm not not completely sure, right? Okay.
it must look for relief by sacrificing the one to the other. But as the smooth passage of our thought along our resembling perceptions makes us ascribe to them an identity, we can never without reluctance yield up that opinion. We must, therefore, turn to the other side and suppose that our perceptions are no longer interrupted, but preserve a continued as well as an invariable existence, and are by that means entirely the same. But here, the interruptions in the appearance of these perceptions are so long and frequent that it is impossible to overlook them. And as the appearance of a perception in the mind and its existence seem at first sight entirely the same, it may be doubted whether we can ever assent to so palpable a contradiction, and suppose a perception to exist without being present to the mind. In order to clear up this matter and learn how the interruption,
He does imply, in my opinion, that the mind it's a combination of the mind filling in holes and also juggling various impressions into a story, right? And I'm on board with that. I think that the mind creates a lot of stuff in the perception that most vulgar quote people would consider a part of the experience as such. Something like space arriving from the outside, right? And motion is arriving from the outside. No, motion is just an interpretation of a comparison between a memory and an impression, right? Because this second there's a new impression and a new impression inside of this, 24 frames a minute, a second, like a movie, right? You could say, and if it's uninterrupted, you could say it's still the same situation. I would be fully on board with that. But strictly speaking, it's a sequence. You could see it like that, right? Maybe sort of approaching an infinite number of given impressions in a given situation. But on the other hand, you could, allude to movies, right, where there are 20 frames a second, and they're called movies. They are not called slideshows, right? They're called movies. It's as if the stuff is moving about, right? And 60 frames per second is very smooth and almost, there's no jitteriness or anything like that, right? The mind apparently smoothens it out, right? And that's what the mind does. And it's not because we can say that. Uh, I mean, in a way, we must say that it fills out the blanks to some extent, right? But it's just maybe just a way it functions, and we are stretching things to a limit where we can sort of see the limitations or the stuff that the mind might add without actually having an impression which it is based on, right? And this sort of, I think that Hume is discussing here, though a little convoluted, unnecessarily convoluted, yet again, right? And it's these that there are aspects where I think you should do. This is the part where you should be elaborate, and then these other part. No, I'm fine with the mind doing, creating stories and filling out the blanks, and so I'm fine with that, right? I guess somebody else might not be, right? But so
in the appearance of a perception implies not necessarily an interruption in its existence. It will be proper to touch upon some principles which we shall have occasion to explain more fully afterwards in section 6. We may begin with observing that the difficulty in
that is actually a reference to the next book, actually, right? The second book in the series. I don't know how quick in succession they were published, but I don't think the first. I think they came out with a little time between them. I'm not sure, right? I might be wrong on that actually. But if I'm right, he's actually referring to a section that the reader couldn't read at this point, right? So I might actually check up on that, and maybe a few afterthoughts after the complete deconstruction of this book, right? Which actually feels like a bit of an undertaking, right? I don't mind doing it. There are certain passages where I'm sort of slightly bored, and other passages that are really up my alley, so to say, right? Though I like all kinds of philosophy, but some more than others because of my perceived or my conceived perception or my conception of their importance, right? Okay.
in the present case is not concerning the matter of fact, or whether the mind forms such a conclusion concerning the continued existence of its perceptions, but only concerning the manner in which the conclusion is formed, and principles from which it is derived. It is certain that almost all mankind, and even philosophers themselves, for the greatest part of their lives, take their perceptions to be their only objects, and suppose that the very being which is intimately present to the mind is the real body or material existence. It is also certain that this very perception or object is supposed to have a continued uninterrupted being, and neither to be annihilated by our absence nor to be brought into existence by our presence.
Okay, so it is certain. Okay. He claims certainty here, right? I think that's a bit more than he can chew. He says, it is certain that almost all mankind, and even philosophers themselves, for the greatest part of their lives, take their perceptions to be their only objects, and suppose that the very being which is intimately present to the mind is the real body or material existence. This is a confusing statement, right? Because it seems like he is sort of in this gray zone of confusion. It should be more clearly. He can do some discussion, but it should be more clearly stated what he's referring to, right? That the perception to be the only objects, but perceptions is not an object, is it? Right? That doesn't fit with how he has framed it earlier. And suppose that the very being which is intimately present to the mind, the being meaning themselves, is the real body or material existence. No, but that's correct. But then you can't say there's an object which is responsible for your body. Then yes, but it's this thing about, if you don't claim there is an outside, you're a solipsist. And if you're a solipsist, why are you writing a fucking book as if there's somebody outside your mind, right? That doesn't seem reasonable, right? So you're not a solipsist. So you think there's something outside your mind, right? Okay, how do you get to that outside? By experience? Obviously not, because they're part of your mind, right? What else? Well, all you can refer to is something that is part of your mind. So how do you get to establish that outside? Well, in my opinion, the only way to do it is to state it axiomatically. I am working from the idea of the outside, and these particular aspects of my mind are representations of whatever. Some kind of representation of an outside. That's as far as you can go. And then you have established that it's you working from it, and you haven't established more than you can based on what you have, which is your experience, right? But you are arranging your philosophy according to the idea that what you have is not the actual thing, but your version of it, right? That's the building block of your philosophy, in my opinion. So it is convoluted and slightly, if not quite, confused, this. Or I'm just confused of how to understand what he's saying, right? And that is certainly also possibly, or surely possible, I should say, right?
When we are absent from it, we say it still exists, but that we do not feel, we do not see it. When we are present, we say we feel or see it. Here then may arise two questions. First, how can we satisfy ourselves in supposing a perception to be absent from the mind without being annihilated? Secondly, after what manner we conceive an object to become present to the mind without some new creation of a perception or image, and what we mean by this seeing and feeling and perceiving. As to the first question, we may observe that what we call a mind is nothing but a heap or collection of different perceptions united together by certain relations and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. Now, as every perception is distinguishable,
I think this is a quite strong sentence, this. We may observe that what we call a mind is nothing but a heap of or collection of different perceptions united together by a certain relation and supposed, you should say, perception, different perception, where if perception is a catch-all term for impressions and ideas, and I think that's how he framed it as far as I remember, right? Okay, different perceptions united together by certain relations and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. Yeah, sure, yeah.
from another and may be considered as separately existent, it evidently follows that there is no absurdity in separating any particular perception from the mind, that is, in breaking off all its relations with that connected mass of perceptions which constitute a thinking being. The same reasoning affords us an answer to the second question. If the name of perception renders not this separation from a mind absurd and contradictory, the name of object, standing for the very same thing, can never render their conjunction impossible. External objects are seen and felt and become present to the mind. That is, they acquire such a relation to a connected heap of perceptions.
Okay, so again, he states it, he's suffering from the materialist fallacy, right? And I'm not trying to bash materialist as such. It's just a label I've put on it, right? that somehow, without being strictly clear about it, he's referring to something outside his mind that manifests in his mind. So his memory and these connections he's talking about somehow, for unknown reasons, makes him able to extend that to some kind of understanding of an outside, right? It's mostly implied, or at least quite a lot of implication, and no sort of strictness of why he's going there and stating it. It's implied, right? But I don't like it, and it's going to screw with his philosophy, right? I would think.
As to influence them very considerably in augmenting their number by present reflections and passions, and in storing the memory with ideas. The same continued and uninterrupted being may, therefore, be sometimes present to the mind and sometimes absent from it, without any real or essential change in the being itself. An interrupted appearance to the senses implies not necessarily an interruption in the existence.
No, but it doesn't prove anything either, right? So an interruption is just, if you don't have empiricism, you don't have knowledge, right? And I guess empiricism and knowledge is my reference to those are based on my understandings of those. So you might have different understandings, so that we might be sort of discrepancy in our understandings of these things. But just leave it alone, man, right? Why? I mean, if you're an empiricist, which I don't know if actually he called himself an empiricist. This is a later term, attached to Hume, right? That stick to what you have access to, right? It's like he wants to establish something outside himself as stable and predictable and scientific and so on, right? This is sort of the fetish of the materialist that enforces the idea of understanding your perceptions as an outside, right? Because you sort of desperately need it to be predictable and scientific, right? Otherwise, there's no backing of Newton's laws and so on. If it isn't steady and predictable, all that's whatever's out there, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't use it just because you can't argue for its existence and regularity. It's about what you choose to do, right? Nobody should tell you what you should do and how you should do it and what you should base that decision on, right? It's all up to you. It's not up to Hume. It's not up to me. It's up to you, right? You are the one doing the science, doing the empiricism, doing the philosophy, making the decisions. It's your life, right? It's your experience. You're the closest one, and actually the only one, I would say, to have access to your experiences. You're the one making the decisions based on your experiences. And if you don't have experiences, the second best thing you have is your reasonings about what might be the case in the future to make the best possible decisions on what to do with this particular expectation of what is going to happen based on those interactions you have with the world, right? This is sort of it's quite simple when you dwindle it down from this sort of ivory tower of philosophy, right? It doesn't have to be so complicated as people make it out to be, right? I mean, I can sit here and think about meta-ethics, metaphysics for that matter, but meta-ethics for hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon days and years and years and years without getting anywhere, right? But when I cooked my pasta yesterday, I was, moving it about a little too quickly, and a bit of the water flew out of the casserole, right? And it had the direction toward my hand. I hold the, casserole, what's it called, the pot, in my hand to make it hold it steady while I was, stirring it, right? And this bit of water flew towards my hand, and I just removed my hand like this, right? Now, if my mind didn't work without me doing some harebrained kind of philosophy in order to get things done, right? How would I be able to do a thing like that, right? So there are all sorts of shit going on that seems to work. So if I'm coming up with some fucking harebrained story about how it works, I don't think it's a functional kind of philosophy, right? It has to be something you can sort of, you don't need to have a library of 1,000 books in order to understand whether or not to move your hand when water shoots against it, right? And any other similar kind of situation in your everyday, right? The most important aspects, though, are of moral kind, I would say, right? Though, or metaphysics and epistemology are important in order to get there. But the most difficult is possibly ethics, right? To get somewhere in. While I would say metaphysics and epistemology are quite easy, in my opinion. And it seems difficult because those academic philosophers, they make it so fucking difficult because it's their job to make it difficult so they can keep financing their life, right? They're not interested in getting to any consensus of any kind. Of course not, right? So if a philosophy is hard to understand and very convoluted and impenetrable, I don't really trust it, to be honest, right? So that's just my approach. It's sort of a, everyday kind of reasoning, right?
The supposition of the continued existence of sensible objects or perceptions involves no contradiction. We may easily indulge our inclination to that supposition. When the exact resemblance of our perceptions makes us ascribe to them an identity, we may remove the seeming interruption by feigning a continued being, which may fill those intervals and preserve a perfect and entire identity to our perceptions. But as we here not only feign, but believe this continued existence, the question is, from whence arises such a belief? And this question leads us to the fourth member of this system. It has been proved already that belief in general consists in nothing but the vivacity of an idea, and that an idea may acquire this vivacity by its relation to some present impression. Impressions are naturally the most vivid perceptions of the mind, and this quality is in part conveyed by the relation to every connected idea. The relation causes a smooth passage from the impression to the idea, and even gives a propensity to that passage. The mind falls so easily from the one perception to the other that it scarce perceives the change, but retains in the second a considerable share of the vivacity of the first. It is excited by the lively impression, and this vivacity is conveyed to the related idea without any great diminution in the
maybe I should let him
passage,
finish.
by reason of the smooth transition and the propensity of the imagination.
He sort of argues that there's sort of a spillover from if I'm looking at my door, looking away from my door, looking at my door, looking away from my door, the vivacity of my idea of that door is like it is enhanced. And it's actually a very interesting aspect he is delving into here, right? And I would sort of agree with him. But it's like, it's something akin to, I'm not even sure if this is correct, but apparently, Eskimos have, 30 different words for snow and various kinds of ice, right? Because they're so used to looking at ice and the different shapes and how much water is in it and the how it feels and how it looks and sizes of the beads, whatever it's called, crystals, right? So they have 30 different words for snow, and various different ways to approach that different kind of snow, right? But to me, snow is just snow because I'm not an Eskimo, right? So it's like if you are very focused on X, on objects of a particular kind or a particular object, the vivacity of your idea of that object is expanded in the scope of the qualia attributes that particular object has, right? So it's sort of if you are around elephants all day long, right? You have a very strong vivacity concerning your idea of elephant, you could say, right? If you only seen an elephant, the last time I saw an elephant was like 10 years ago, maybe, right? I don't remember, maybe a little less, but I have an idea, and I remember a particular episode where I saw an elephant. I can sort of recall an episode where I saw 3 elephants outside the circus, something like that, with my children. Something like that, right? So I think I agree with this, but I don't. It's sort of he's alluding to this kind of okay. Is he going to say okay, and therefore I have proven there is constancy in existence? Then he will be having taken a step too far, right?
But suppose that this propensity arises from some other principle besides that of relation. It is evident it must still have the same effect and convey the vivacity from the impression to the idea. Now, this is exactly the present case. Our memory presents us with a vast number of instances of perceptions perfectly resembling each other that return at different distances of time and after considerable interruptions. This resemblance gives us a propension to consider these interrupted perceptions as the same, and also a propension to connect them by a continued existence in order to justify this identity and avoid the contradiction in which the interrupted appearance of these perceptions seems necessarily to involve us. Here, then, we have a propensity to feign the continued existence of all sensible objects. And as this propensity arises from some lively impressions of the memory, it bestows a vivacity on that fiction, or, in other words, makes us believe the continued existence of body. If sometimes we ascribe a continued existence to objects which are perfectly new to us, and of whose constancy and coherence we have no experience, it is because the manner in which they present themselves to our senses resembles that of constant and coherent objects, and this resemblance is a source of reasoning and analogy, and leads us to attribute the same qualities to similar objects. I believe an intelligent reader will find less difficulty to assent to this system than to comprehend it fully and distinctly, and will allow, after a little reflection, that every part carries its own proof along with it. It is indeed evident that as the vulgar suppose their perceptions to be their only objects, and at the same time believe the continued existence of matter, we must account for the origin of the belief upon that supposition. Now, upon that supposition, it is a false opinion that any of our objects or perceptions are identically the same after an interruption, and consequently, the opinion of their identity can never arise from reason, but must arise from the imagination. The imagination is seduced into such an opinion only by means of the resemblance of certain perceptions, since we find they are only our resembling perceptions which we have a propension to suppose the same. This propension to bestow an identity on our resembling perceptions produces the fiction of a continued existence, since that fiction, as well as the identity, is really false, as is acknowledged by all philosophers, and has no other effect than to remedy the interruption of our perceptions, which is the only circumstance that is contrary to their identity. In the last place, this propension causes belief by means of the present impressions of the memory, since without the remembrance of former sensations, it is plain we never should have any belief of the continued existence of body. Thus, in examining all these parts, we find that each of them is supported by the strongest proofs, and that all of them together form a consistent system which is perfectly convincing. A strong propensity or inclination alone, without any present impression, will sometimes cause a belief or opinion. How much more when aided by that circumstance? But though we are led after this manner by the natural...
Okay, so I think I will stop here and keep the second half of this audio to the next part, and I could possibly fit that into 1 hour or so. Yes, I think I've said what I need to say, and I'll just say we'll see each other in the next one. Please consider sharing, liking, and subscribing. And beyond that, have a nice day. See you in the next one.